Welcome to Running in the 70s, where we interview, meet, and get to know athletes of all kind who were running in the 70s. I'm your host, Matthew Kleinowski.
Today on the podcast, we are staying north of the border in the true north with a Canadian record holder, an early starter during the 60s who broke a lot of barriers and went to a famous school in the States, Villanova. He's author of a book about the glory years of Villanova in the distance medley. And he returned to Canada, did some more running, and involved in the sport at the management and organization level. So we've got a lot of stories today. Be very glad to talk today to Jerry Bouma. Welcome. Is that how you say your last name?
No,
Bouma and Bouma.
Well, Matt, the Canadians say Bouma. The Americans call me Bouma. But if you go to my Dutch roots, they say Bauma.
Yeah.
Bouma. I say, if you live in a house, call me Bouma. If you live in a house, call me Bouma. If you live in a house, call me Bauma.
That's great. All right. I'll call you Jerry today. Jerry, I want to tell people all the way back from your origin story.
Right.
Just a little bit about your parents and how they immigrated to Canada.
Right. Well, Matt, that is significant. The Canadian Army of the Allied Forces liberated the Netherlands back in first in the fall of 44, the south part, what's called the Battle of Skeld, and then in April, early May of 1945, the rest of the Netherlands. My parents were 15 years of age or 16 when the liberation took place. And of course, that was a hugely significant event because they had just experienced some of the most oppressive, dark days and brutal occupation. And then come along these Canadians, which they never even heard of the country, liberating. And they were struck by not only their ability as soldiers, but how kind and gracious they were. And the thing that really shocked the Dutch people to this day, not really understanding why would these young men, because they're 20, 21, 22, come and save us from our neighbors. They never really understood that. And that's why they're so appreciative of the Canadian war effort to this day. In fact, we have the 80th anniversary of the liberation coming up in May of this year. My parents were obviously influenced by that. They married when they were 21. At that time, the economic conditions in the Netherlands were quite grim. They were both from farms, the opportunity to farm because both of them were not the oldest. And at that time, Canada was inviting immigration. So they stepped on a boat in late February, early March of 1951, and it arrived in the shores of Canada, Halifax, Pier 21, March 26th. Took a train to Ontario, ended up working on a farm as they were sponsored, as most Dutch immigrants were, for a period of 4 years, and then started farming themselves. They rented, quite frankly, a very poor piece of property in a rural part of, about 2 hours north of Toronto, northwest of Toronto in Grey County. And when they rented this property, subsequently I've spoken to some of the neighbors, they thought, oh, these people are going to starve. Well, my father was very astute and a very effective cost manager, an extremely hard worker. Within 5 years, he'd saved enough money to buy one of the best farms in the county, actually, outside of a village called Leith, which is about 6 miles from Owen Sound. Also the home and the burial place of Tom Thompson, the famous painter, influencer of the Group 7. And so we're dairy farmers. I grew up on a farm, and fundamentally, Matt, which of relevance to my background was a couple of things. One, hard work. Number two, the discipline. When you're on a dairy farm, your life is so structured and predetermined. You got to milk cows twice a day. You've got your spring seeding, your haying, your harvest. There's hardly a day when you already don't know well in advance what's going to happen. The other thing that I would say is that my parents, growing up during the war and growing up in a European country, had no appreciation for sports or sports culture. And I was always really keenly interested in hockey and baseball, and I was reading books in the library about hockey players and baseball players. And I remember my grade 6 reader reading about Roger Bannister breaking the 4-minute mile, which quite fascinated me. I wanted to play hockey, really couldn't because there was no way to get to town, so to speak. I started high school really young. I was only 12 when I started high school. And again, it was difficult for me to engage in any sort of team sports. So I ran a little bit of track my first year, finished last in the 100. So nothing very aspiring or noteworthy there. I ran some cross country. Was like the fourth man or fifth man on the what was called the 15 and under group. Then the summer before my 11th grade, the high school teacher that was in charge of cross country, 1st of August, sent out a schedule, a training schedule, and it introduced me to interval training. Like I started by doing repeat 100s, repeat 200s, repeat 440s back then. And I took that schedule and I said, and I remember that day, I was 14 years of age. I said, I'm going to make this work for me. I literally remember I'm going to be a track star. So I went out to the road with my sister and had a 10-yard piece of twine and measured out the 110, the 220, the 440, and the 880. And I started doing intervals. And when I came back 4 or 5 weeks later, when school started, I was determined because I put in the training. And then I won my first race. So that was 14, and very quickly started reading about Bannister's. One of the few books available at the time was the 4-Minute Mile by Roger Bannister. So I was introduced to Ferenc Stampla and the interval training, typically the 10 times 440 and the 5 times 80. I turned 15 that fall, and by the summer of 68, I'm now 15. I finished fifth in the Ontario 15 and under mile and the 880. Then I went on to win the Eastern Canadian Championships for my age class. I definitely knew this is what I wanted to do, and I was very committed to becoming the best I could be. It was about that time, probably in 68, 69, that's when I first read about Villanova. I read the Dave Patrick story when he was on the cover of Sports Illustrated. That was my first introduction to Villanova, and I thought, wow, he was the number one in the world.
Let me ask you a little bit about what things were like in a Canadian school in the 60s still there. You're running on a road with a twine measured course. What facilities were at the school? Shoes? How did all that work? And how was the communication and your coach finding out about these events inside Canada? What was all that like?
Well, very quickly, the coach was not able to provide much. Really, from that point on, once I did the first month of intervals, I basically charted my own course. We have dirt track at the high school. And because I need to take the bus home, I seldom trained on it. So I'd come home and train on the roads. The shoes, well, I started out with a high top canvas. And I think I bought my first pair of ROMs back in about 67, 68. From that point on, and I look at that, Matt, I bought a pair of ROMs and then a pair of Gazelles was my next shoes. And the next one was a pair of Golds, Aztecs, I believe. We would wear a pair of shoes for a year. And even at my first year at Villanova, I bet I put 1,500 or 2,000 miles on a pair of shoes. I don't know if they were just because they were so badly made or so firmly made, they didn't seem to wear out.
What about the reaction of your parents to your success and the demands of training and being a student, which was probably very important to them?
My parents, quite frankly, Matt, had a very detached view. They focused on, I call it, feeding and watering us and clothing us and housing us. But what we did with our own time in the school, they may have shown some interest, but they never gave us any feedback. Fortunately, I was a good student, and then my athletic career started to unfold. No feedback. That was just part of growing up. So there was no support really, other than I will look back, and my father did allow me the opportunity to train, but I had a very limited amount of time, and that was probably one of my secrets because I couldn't overtrain. By the time I got off the bus, we had about a half-mile laneway. We had a long laneway. Did a quick change. I had about 40 minutes, maybe 50 minutes before I had to be in the barn to start helping chores. So that 50 minutes, I started doing a lot of repeat 200s. I'd read about Gerschler, the German coach that had trained soldiers in World War II, and he found that in 6 weeks of interval training using repeat 200s as the most effective way of getting people in shape. And somehow I came across that article and I started doing repeat 200s. And that was really probably the key to my really rapid progression, because I went from, like say, 430 to 420 to sub 410 by the time I was 17. And I look back at that, I was very young and very physically immature because no hair on my face, skinny, very boyish looking, but I'm running sub 410 on my own, no coaching, lots of training, but no coaching. And I really think if I had stayed in high school for another year and matured a little bit, I could have gotten close to 4 minutes just in what I was doing.
What about the other runners, other coaches you encountered at these races? Did you have much interaction with them?
Well, I was an intense listener, curious as to what people were doing. You mentioned about what sort of infrastructure was there in place. Well, you had the high school program, which was the local meet, the district meet, the larger district meet, and the all Ontarios, the all provincial meet. That was something that you naturally were exposed to. And when I turned 50 last summer, I joined Owen Sound had a track club. I joined that. There were a couple more runners, and I might get a chance to run with them once a week at the most. But that exposed us to the club system and introduced you to, again, regional meets, provincial meets, Eastern Canadian meets, national meets. That was very fortunate because at that time, the Legion was very active in supporting track clubs. And there were a number of clubs throughout Canada sponsored by the Canadian Legion, as was the club in Owen Sound. Of course, you started listening and learning. I was probably most influenced by the books I was reading, though, the Bannister book, and then what I read about Gershler were probably my two biggest influences. I kind of charted my own course because I had such a limited amount of time that I had to do something that was very intense and time effective. So that was the key source. And then, of course, the thing that was happening at the time, which I didn't really fully appreciate till I got to Villanova, was the influence of LSD, long, slow distance. And one of the reasons I wanted to go to Villanova was because the number 1 mile in the world, Marty LaQuarrie, was there. And I said, well, that's where I want to go. Unfortunately, I had the credentials to go there. And so what do? You do what the best runner in the world's doing.
What would you guess was your self-directed training mileage your final year? And
Probably in high school, 35 miles a week.
mm-hmm.
One long run and maybe 5 track workouts, or maybe 1 hill workout, 4 track workouts, and a longish run.
Your book, Touching Greatness, about the Villanova story, the distance medley relay over 16 years, you go into quite a lot of detail about the training. We'll talk about that.
Yeah.
I got to tell you one thing about the book that I liked. My career was cut short by injury, but what thing that struck me, I was like, oh my gosh, I never thought about this. The parallels to exactly what we're talking about this podcast, the era. I went to a small college in Western Pennsylvania, Indiana. We had a field house, an old building. We had next to it a kind of a crappy track. We had a cage with pens, which you put your laundry on. I'm like, oh my God, what a great experience. This was brought back memories of that same stuff that was quite different. And Villanova was a big, successful school, but had the trappings of just another little college. Now, let me go back to your discovery of Villanova and your pursuit of going there. How did you handle that?
I remember sitting in the school library reading Sports Illustrated. It was this March 69, so I'm grade 12. And back then, Ontario had grade 13, so I had another year to go. I'm 16. I'm reading about the LaQuarrie-Ryan race, the first time they went head-to-head at Cobo Hall NCAA indoors, and I'm just absolutely fascinated by it. And then later that summer, LaQuarrie beat Ryan 3 times in a row. That really cemented my resolve, if you will, saying to myself, this is where I want to go. Not knowing much about the school other than the best miler in the world was there, and I had a sense there was a pretty good program at play. In the winter, about this time of year, 1970, which is now 55 years ago, can't believe it, I was getting ready for the Canadian Indoor Junior Championships, and I ended up running the 1,500 meters in 3:56 on a 11-lap board track in Winnipeg, and that was a new Canadian record by quite a bit, and it translates to about a 4:14 mile. I think was about the 3rd fastest high school mile at the time in the U.S. So I wrote Villanova, introduced myself, and told them what I was running, told them a bit about training. Never heard anything until about 2 months later. I think it was maybe late April. There was a fellow in London, Ontario, who was a high school teacher, but he also did some writing for Runner's World. And he'd just done an extensive interview on LaQuarrie, because LaQuarrie was now the number one guy in the world. So he went to Villanova, and when he was there, Jumbo Elliott and Jack Pryor, Mr. Pryor, asked about who's this Jerry Bouma kid out of Ontario, because they remember the letter. And Dave had heard a bit about me, but not a lot, but he contacted me and indicated that there was some interest in me. And I thought, well, that's great. What happened then, Matt, then I went on to win both the Ontario mile and half mile double championships in the
First time that ever happened, right?
I think so. I'm not sure. It's pretty rare. I know that much. And I get it, and I'm leading in the mile there. And you know how competitive also is. Usually have 30 guys fighting it out or within contention, at least for the first 2 laps. Well, after 3 laps, I've got a full 100 meters on the field because I already took it out. I took it out hard and ended up tying up, but I still won the race by quite a bit. And that afternoon, I'm the only guy to run double, and we had to qualify for the 800 the night before, which I did. And I thought, gee, I'm the only guy doubling. I was kind of sick after the mile. I thought, gee, I don't know if I could take this. So I just kind of sat back and waited at the bell on last. And then I thought, I'm feeling pretty good. And I started moving and then ended up winning by almost 2 seconds. I just was really fresh. Should have learned a hard lesson there. Sometimes it's a lot better to sit back and wait as opposed to front. And then I ran a 400 mile on a dirt track in Scarborough, at the Birchmount Stadium, and it was the last meet of the day. So it was all chewed up. And, I'm looking at that now, and I think it was a decent track. That probably would have been a 405 or 406. And then I took a bus to London, Ontario, met up with Dave Prokop, and together we traveled by bus to Des Moines, Iowa, where the NCAs were on, and I joined up with the Villanova team. And met Jumbo and met the LaQuarrie and met Dick Berkeley and met Chris Mason and Andy O'Reilly and all those guys. And then I traveled back to Villanova with the team after that. And that was my introduction to the school. And my host at Villanova was Dave Patrick. Dave Patrick and I have become very good friends over the years. He's probably one of my closest friends, actually. Dave, of course, as you know, was ranked number 1 in the world in the 880 and 68 and should have gone to the Olympics, but that's a whole other story. That's what cemented the relationship and my commitment for a scholarship. Meanwhile, I was getting calls from Texas, Ohio State, Eastern Michigan, Kansas, all kinds of schools. But it was really easy for me because I wanted to go to where the best were, and that was pretty easy. Villanova.
In 1970, it's great. This stuff is in your book, and you've written about things were changing right at the beginning of the decade. I don't know exactly the rules on which colleges, but up until that point, not only in cross country, but in some sports, basketball, for example, freshmen were not varsity eligible. But you got to Villanova in your first year, you could run varsity.
Right. That's the first year it happened. 70, 71 was the first time freshmen actually could compete on varsity teams. So technically, I became the first freshman to win a Penn Relays watch because I led off the 4-mile relay team, which LaQuarrie anchored, and you knew if you could just be still standing and pass the stick to LaQuarrie, he was going to win it. I ended off third, let's say, and the next 2 guys basically held that position. I think ended up passing LaQuarrie the stick, and we won that race.
What was the facilities like at the Penn Relays in 1970?
Oh, they were good because the transfer from a cinder track to a all-weather track took place, I think, in late 67. So 68 was the first year there was an all-weather track there. So it was clearly one of the best facilities for running that you could have at the time. And it was such a tremendous atmosphere. You coming from Pennsylvania, I'm sure you've been to Franklin Field. You couldn't get a more festive, lively, energetic place than the Penn Relays and the 30, 40,000 people, sometimes up to 50,000 people that go there. And a
knowledgeable fans.
And a nonstop racing, like race after race after race after race, because you have all these high school sections and junior college, and then the Championships of America, which were the feature races.
Yeah, you were able to run as a freshman on the 4-mile relay. That's there. Right. But let's go into getting to that season, the training and facilities of Villanova. It's fascinating in your book. You describe it. And of course, the famous indoor track set in the outdoors.
Yeah.
Set up and taken apart every year.
Exactly. It would. It would emerge in early December. The main and staff were charged with putting this thing up. So it was straight away with a 11 laps to a mile track. It was like, banked, but not excessively banked. And that served as I call it the anvil, our training experience. Generally speaking, we had an old field house we didn't even have a proper locker room. We just had a hallway with a bunch of lockers on the one side of the hall. Of course, LaCory had the first locker. And after that, I think John Hartnett had it, and then Eamon Coughlin would have it. So you always had the number one guy would have the first locker, and everybody else sort of fell in line. There was just a fairly narrow hallway with some old trunks on the side, which we'd sit on after we're changing and as we dressed and undressed. The track itself was a beat up old cinder track. There wasn't much in the way of cinders left on it. And every time it rained, the one end would be completely flooded. And then the board track, which was set up in mid-December. We wouldn't do any formal workouts in December on the track. Some of us would go out there and sort of test it out. The training for indoor started when we came back after January 1st. It was indoor track outdoors. And in Philadelphia, we can get some pretty wicked winds, damp, cold winds. It's not, right now here in Edmonton, it's like -5 Fahrenheit, but it's dry and it's sunny and it's not bad at all. But at Villanova, if it's, 27 or 26 degrees or just below freezing with a wicked wind, a damp wind, that's cold. And sometimes it would snow a lot. Sometimes you'd have to sweep the snow off the boards first and warm up, and then away we go. But the other really interesting thing, Matt, which I think is so unique to Villanova, is that Jumbo was hardly ever there. Coaching was a hobby for him. He ran a very successful business. We saw very little of him in the fall, maybe once a week during cross country, when we would do, after a couple of weeks of putting the miles in on the roads, Tuesday nights we would do repeat 440s, and Jumbo would show up then. Well, show up, he'd supervise that, of course. But indoor season, he would drive in about 3:30. We would be ready warmed up, throw it over to the boards, and he would have a brief chat with usually the leaders like a LaCory or a Hartnett or a Coughlin or a Shepard or a Page. And then we'd hear through the grapevine what the workout was going to be, and off we went. So a lot of 3-lappers, 2-lappers, 5-lappers, and 160 is the denomination. So a 3-lapper is 480 yards, just a little longer than a 440. A 2-lapper is 320, just a little shorter than a 300 meters. 5-lapper is just a little short of a half mile.
What about Coach Pyra? Where was he at 3:30 and during interval running and the rest?
He was there, overcoat, hat, boots, because it was, and we had a little sort of almost like a telephone booth they could stand in to break the wind. He was always there, clipboard in hand. He was not the technical coach. We called him Mother Pyra, because Mother Pyra was one of these people that was extremely accommodating and deferential to Jumbo. I can tell you this, Matt, if it wasn't for that combination, like the sort of the harsh father figure of Jumbo that detached, this is the way it's going to be, I don't want any discussion on it, with the nurturing kind of follow-up, always open door, always available Pyra, who kind of looked after all the details and the personal issues and the emotions and the concerns. That's one of the keys to the success of the Villanova program, was that juxtaposition of character and role. And not many people would have played the kind of deferential role that Pyra did relative to Jumbo, because he wasn't a great guy to really get along with. I mean, if either looked up to him and respected him or stay out of his way.
And just to be clear for everybody, you're a bunch of college kids. You didn't call them Jumbo and Mother to their face, did you?
Oh, no. It was Mr. Elliott. No, it was Mr. Elliott all the time. There was a tremendous amount of respect between the athletes and the coach, Mr. Elliott. And we always called Mr. Pyra too.
Jumbo was not a big Jumbo guy.
No, that was the irony. And the reason he had the name Jumbo is because when he was an athlete in the 30s, and he was a pretty good 400-meter runner, there was a big Philadelphia Phillies pitcher by the name of Jumbo Elliott. He was like 6'4", over 200 pounds, which was a big deal back then. Jumbo himself was maybe 5'10", and kind of a wiry bird-like kind of creature. He was quite slender, He probably didn't weigh 150, 155 pounds. But his character was jumbo. It was suitable because he had such an enormous presence and enormous influence. We never even thought that the name wasn't fitting because it was very fitting metaphorically.
One other fun thing about cross country, and everybody who's involved in this is going to have this, we end up with these courses or places that we run that get nicknames and they become proper names and we lose them. IUP had the Tit, the 9 Mile Loop. Where are some of the Villanova trails?
Well, the well-established route, it was a 10-mile route. It was called the Frolic because there had been some playful events that had taken place over the years during the Patrick days. When I read the story about LaQuarrie, when I was still in high school, he talked about running around the Frolic. We had a loop we called triple. I won't use the FU dot K, and because at the 2.5 mile mark, we had to go up this really steep hill, and it had sort of 3 stages to it. The first was a long, really steady climb, then it leveled off just a little bit. Then the next stage was a little bit shorter, but even steeper, and then the final stage was even shorter and steeper. It was called the infamous triple. We had another loop, and I was instrumental in establishing this loop, and it became the most favored route called the tennis court loop. Because we went through behind Haverford College, through Bryn Mawr College, and then into some of the most opulent estates that are in the region, which is characteristic of the mainline area, because some real wealth established estates in the area, like the DuPonts, for example. The fellow that invented patent leather had this beautiful estate. We called it La Ronda because it had very Spanish kind of style to it. And that was about a 9-mile loop, and it was quite quiet. There wasn't much traffic there. That became the tested loop because I even went back a couple of years ago to Villanova and talked about the guys because the traffic was a problem already back in the 70s, particularly in the Frolic, and it only got worse. The tennis court loop was the most favored loop, and there we had the Radnor 5, and we had the Bryn Mawr 5, and the 3.5, which was sometimes referred to as the Dave Patrick Memorial Loop, because everybody's giving him a hard time because they didn't think he was doing much mileage. And the most they were in was the 3.5 mile loop.
And the sprinters would be slow. That's the one that could finish, huh?
Exactly. We'd see the sprinters in the 3.5, and
I lived for a short while in Seacane, and I worked in media. The main line is a beautiful historic area of eastern Pennsylvania, and Villanova is a part of that. And some of those colleges you mentioned, Bryn Mawr, just institutions as old as the country itself.
Right.
Let's talk about your integration with the program and how you took as an entering freshman with a great deal of talent and making it to one of the relays at the Penn Relays team. As you said, you were a good student. You were going to take it seriously. Talk about your freshman year and adjusting to that. And certainly not everybody's a great student, but I know it was a priority for Jumbo and get to the library and all that stuff to anybody struggling. It was hands off. It was just do the job if you want to be on this team.
Matt, back in my farm boy days, I was governed by a lack of time. And the big shift that took place for me was now being a college boy and 3 or maybe the most 4 classes a day, having a lot of time. My work ethic, thanks to my parents who worked so hard, my view was I can work as hard or harder than anybody. And that was probably my strength and it's a weakness. My first week at Villanova, I arrive. It's hotter than hell. It's over 90 degrees temperature and or 90% humidity. It was just brutal. My first week, I ran 96 miles. The following week, I think I ran close to 100. I was absolutely totally committed. I'm going to work as hard as anybody. And of course, at that time, LaQuarrie was comfortably running those sort of distances. And Donald Walsh, who was the great cross-country runner that finished second at Prefontaine, was running actually even up to 120 miles a week. So I jumped in full force. I don't think I realized how much of a physical strain that was going to be because I was just tired all the time. Even so, I ran so-so in cross-country, not great. And not as well as I would have liked because we had 2 freshmen, John Hartnett from Ireland, who won the European Juniors. John became my closest friend and we were roommates. He started much slower in terms of the mileage. He just went and he was second behind Bob Wheeler at the IC4A cross country, the freshman division, and Les Nagy was third. The two of them were really running well. And I was struggling. I'm probably finished the top 40, and I was thinking I should be able to run with these guys, but I think I was just too friggin' tired. Then the indoor season, we were still doing 5-6 miles in the morning, and then doing workouts like 10 times 3 lappers or, 15 times 2 lappers. And I'm running okay. I'm running like, 4:15 mile. I ran an 8:26, I think 3,000, which was pretty good time back then. And I ended up running a 3-minute 3/4. And that's what, after I ran that, Jumbo said, yeah, you're on the 4-mile relay team, which I had no idea at the time how significant that was, because as you know, from being from Pennsylvania, and anybody who grew up in New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, I mean, Penn relays was the Mecca, was the Olympics, and to get chosen to run on a relay team there. So there's all kinds of guys at Villanova who were just waiting to be picked. And here this skinny freshman comes along and gets picked to run on the 4-mile relay team.
So let's talk IC4As. How, compared to Penn relays and everything else, those were a big deal.
Oh, yeah. Next to the NCAAs, that was the race or the meet to perform. And Villanova always did extremely well. We were fortunate. At that time, Princeton had just built a great facility, the Jadwood Gym, and so they had a 200-meter track, and that's where the indoor IC4As would be. The outdoor ICs got moved around a bit, Rutgers or Pittsburgh a couple of years. But yeah, that was a big deal to do well at the IC4As.
I want to talk about your experience there in your freshman year at track, but the training on the indoor track, outdoors, were you running 3 or 4 interval sessions a week? It sounded like it was very simple. There was long stroke distance, and then there were repeat quarters or repeat lappers, but it was 3 or 4 days a week.
That's right. We would typically train Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. If we had a race on Friday, Thursday would be an off day. If we had a race on Saturday, Thursdays would be an easier track day, but 4 days in those weeks. And the rest of the time you put in some miles. But the problem is, and I look back at it now, is that we didn't know the meaning of slow. We thought when we ran on the roads, we had to push. I look back at that now, and I realized that the workload and the pace we were trying to run, like we're always thinking in our minds, if you're going to run the roads, you should run 6-minute miles. If you're not running 6-minute miles, you're not working hard enough. And sometimes we, run faster than that. Very seldom run slower than that. But interestingly enough, how training's evolved, and you look at how the mix of really high quality sessions with recovery slow sessions, which I think Ingebrigtsen has perfected. Donald Walsh, our Irish guy, which we called the Troll, he was doing that, and no one wanted to run with him because he running too damn slow. And he was running like 120 miles a week, but he was running like 7 minutes, 7:30 miles. But he would have 2 hard efforts a week. One was the 20 times 440s, and the other one was the cross country race. And those were his 2 hard sessions, and it worked beautifully for him. And I look back at it now and I realize that Donald was putting in the miles and building that capacity, but he was doing it nice and easy. And some of us were out there, busting, thinking, well, we got to put it, Donald's wasting our time running with him. But had we done that, I think I would have run better. Let's put it that way.
Not all one size fits all, but that's generally, most people are going to do better with that. Yeah, like you say, we probably think that way now. Let me ask you about what you can remember or what you think was your attitude, not as successful or accomplished in cross country your freshman year, and then you make one of the Villanova Penn relays gold medals the freshman year. How were you feeling at the end of your freshman year?
Well, being the first freshman, I thought, this is great. I'm a freshman. I already win a Penn relays watch, which was the coveted prize that everybody sought. So I thought, well, there's a lot more of those to come. Well, lo and behold, my sophomore year, I started noticing pain in my ankle just after cross country. I was starting to run pretty good cross country. I was 6th or 7th man, which was pretty good given that we had won the NCAA championships the year before. I would have to take some time off and run, and it would get sore again, and take some time off, get run and get sore again. And finally, we went to get x-rays, and lo and behold, I got bone spurs. I got and most unusual situation. I had a bone spur on the base of the tibia and a bone spur on the talus, sort of like a stalagmite, a stalactite situation, which was tearing the tendon tissue around. And there was only one solution. That was full-scale invasive orthopedic surgery. That's what happened. That happened in February of 72. And then I'm in a cast for 5 or 6 weeks. And then the injury started showing up in November, I missed the entire indoor outdoor season. I'm starting to run again in, say, April, May, but you're so out of it. And then that summer, I'm trying to put in the miles again, and I come back with a lot of pressure on myself, and I re-injure. The tissue was still pretty tender, and I re-injured myself after a track workout, and I basically missed the cross-country season. And then I'm running so-so in track. By that time, I'm really discouraged. I went from this really optimistic, I can be one of the best, I've got all the tools to be one of the best, to, oh shit, I don't know if I want to stay here, because of 2 years. And it's really demoralizing, because the guys you're running with are starting to really excel, winning championships, breaking 4 minutes, and you're struggling.
How was school going through?
Yeah, school always went fine. That was never a problem.
Okay.
But you go from a very positive state of mind to, quite frankly, if you look back at it now, I was probably depressed. And there was no way of diagnosing or treating that. What happens too, when you're not running very well and you're in such a competitive environment, the guys don't know what to do with you. You get sort of move away from you, and you're kind of on your own, which exacerbates the problem. But just, it's a natural reaction.
Yeah.
And of course,
it's not malicious. It's just awkward.
No. Awkward. Yeah, that's right. Meanwhile, Jumbo is nowhere to be seen. And Pyra, he's too busy looking after 30 other guys that are all got their own problems. It's pretty easy to sort of regress and try to solve everything. And being self-motivated, self-directed, self-coached, I'm naturally kind of the person that takes charge. You can kind of devolve into a pretty negative state. So my middle 2 years, and if I look back at what caused the bone spurs, let's go back to high school, doing those repeat 200s on the road. And
on the what kind of was it? It was a paved road?
It was a paved road, but there was a bit of a crown on it, and I would run down the right-hand side of the road on both out and back. And so my left leg, where the spurs developed, was always slightly cocked. And I think that had to have been the cause for those spurs.
Yeah. One thing I can recall from your story is that things got much better. How did you become co-captain? Was your roommate?
Right.
Your roommate?
Yeah. Well, I guess I just always maintained outwardly a positive state. And I came back my last year. I said, okay, I can remember that August before coming back going, man, I don't know. And I go back, and just the sky started opening. I just had a much better feeling. I met a girl that I really quite became attached to, and starting to run a lot better. And so I guess my natural ability to motivate and to lead came through, and that's what happened.
What was the process of team captain selection?
It was a vote.
You were roommates with Hartnett?
John Hartnett, yes.
Yeah, John, just that year? How long?
We're supposed to be roommates our freshman year, but the last minute, another Canadian sprinter suddenly arrived, and he was put with me. Could put the two Canadians together. So he was a very talented guy, but he didn't stick around very long. He made it to the end of the year, but we never saw him again. Then John and I were together the next year, and we were going to stay together all 3 years, but then we got moved to another dorm, single rooms. We were side by side. So for all intents and purposes, we're roommates from that point on.
You got to run that senior year a lot of races, including which stage from high school through your years at Villanova? If you had to pick one distance, what were you best at?
If I look back at it, Matt, my best probably run was 1,000 meters, and that was after I left Villanova.
Yeah.
I ran 1,000 in 1975. I ran 2:24, and that was the fastest time in Canada that year. I was really feeling good. I'd run a 4:05 or 4:04 mile indoors, and then I ran that 1,000, which came really easily. That would probably be the best run I had for my career.
And you set several age group
Right.
Canadian records along the way. Did you have them all listed there when you would run a big race at Villanova? Were you
No.
or
You forgot completely about them. In fact, I forgot all about them until I was asked to submit a bit of a resume. I was inducted into the local Sports Hall of Fame. That won't sound. I was asked to put together my accomplishments. So that's when I said, I went through my mind. It's okay. Yeah. This happened. This happened. This happened. I had completely overlooked or ignored that when I was at Villanova because you're a good runner, but you're in the midst of great runners. And so whatever record you might have had are pale by comparison to your teammates.
were you attending Penn relays while you were unable to race?
Oh, for sure. And with mixed feelings because you're watching your teammates perform and do really well. And you're thinking, that's great, but man, I should be out there. So it was a really a set of mixed emotions and you were fighting euphoria and depression at the same time.
When I talked with Marty, he talked about the idea that when he left Villanova, basically no coaching from Jumbo.
That's right.
Pretty says not no interest. They had a relationship, but his view was you're here for 4 years and that's your career.
That's right. Totally. At that time, once you graduated, it was pretty much presumed that your running career was over. And the first people to actually extend that and make a profession of it were people like LaQuarrie, followed by Dick Burkle, followed by Eamon Coughlin, Don Page, Mark Balger, Sidney Marie, all the people I just mentioned, Marcus O'Sullivan, were really high performers in college, but they could see a future because a future was in fact developing. There was prize money, there were sponsorships, there was opportunity to actually monetize your talents. Well, you had the ITU, the International Track Union, for a couple of years, which was a bit of a circus, and I don't think it really amounted to very much. But up until about the mid-70s, there wasn't much in the way of monetary incentives. LaQuarrie got involved with Brooks Shoes and Athletic Addicts, so he was able to parlay his athletic reputation into advancing himself there. Eamon Coughlin, he had established himself as such a brilliant indoor runner. He was a kind of runner that New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, but New York in particular, came out in droves to see him run. If you look at the Irish diaspora back about 50 years ago, they were emerging as a force, and Eamon Coughlin was a symbol of what Irish people could do, and he did it brilliantly. So he was able to convert that and start to command appearance fees and prize money. He became probably one of the most successful professionals as a runner, and one of the first, actually, and one of the few, I might add.
Let's talk about what happened to you after you left Villanova. You had the interesting situation of a couple of years of eligibility left and across the border. So Canada recognized that, and you had a very successful career back in Ontario.
Right. I ran the university scene for a couple of years. I was the top miler, 1,000-meter runner indoors, won a bunch of races. Then I got injured again. I stepped in a friggin' hole on a fall run, covered the leaves, and ended up with Achilles tendonitis and lean up 76. And I was out for about 3 months, but I came back faster than I expected and ended up finishing 5th or 6th at the first set of Olympic trials. But again, I was 2 or 3 seconds out from being very competitive. Like you had to run 340, and I was running 343, 344, just not quite there. So in summary, Matt, when you asked the photograph you made reference to, and I think you said, "Is that you?" And I said, "Yes." And I was reflecting on that, and I would say I had a brilliant junior career and a pretty mediocre open or senior career. The odd flash of
A national record here and there,
but
You
not
guys-
sustained. Not sustained. And I was losing my drive and momentum as I was finishing my master's degree, thinking about getting a job, thinking about getting married. I realized then how much energy it takes to apply 8 to 9 hours intellectually, because I was in a consulting practice, And you can't sustain the kind of level of physical training when you're applying that much energy intellectually.
We could probably do this for hours and hours. Let's talk about it. 3 main events you organized and brought people in. First, the gala of
Right. The Legends of Gold.
yeah.
Yeah. Edmonton won the bid to host the World Athletic Championships in 2001. I was not that involved early on, but I got involved as things were starting to build. In 1999, I was part of an Edmonton delegation to Seville. That was where our Edmonton operating team was shadowing the Seville team to learn what was being done, how it was being done. I knew the president of the organization, a guy by the name of Rick Lawlisher. Rick is a very astute, street smart individual here in the city, background of football, no background of track whatsoever, but a record of getting things done. When I was in Seville, he noted how many people I knew. Like I ran into Craig Masbach, for example, and Steve Cram and David Henry and all the Canadians. And I'm talking to all these people and he's going, who the hell is this guy? Cool. So when we were back in Edmonton, there was a British guy, and you would be able to relate to this. A guy by the name of Barney Baker, and he came from the British Public School, which is private school. The guy that wears the blazers and the tie, who was absolutely a track nut. And he had attended several Olympics. And when the World Championships came here, he comes to see Rick Lawlisher. And he says, yeah, I want to do this big thing. You know, I want to do some sort of gala. I don't know what it is, but I want to do something. And Rick says, I know who you need to talk to, Jerry. And I was thinking, actually, Matt, of hosting some sort of Villanova and Friends event. So Barney and I got together and he talked about his vision of having this gala event, and he wanted the top 50 historic track and field people all together and 1,500 people with the Edmonton Symphony and a high profile MC. I said, okay, Barney, you put on the circus, I'll bring the livestock. The first person I called was Eamon Coughlin. I said, Eamon, what do you think? Do you think if we invite you and your family, all expenses paid for an event like this, do you think that would fly? And he says, oh, yeah, absolutely. So off we went. I was able to recruit. We had an amazing cast of athletes like Frank Shorter and Joel Benoit and Kip Keinel. And would you believe Herb Elliott, who everybody wanted to meet because Herb disappeared off the scene after he was 22 years of age. Peter Snell, Sebastian Coe, he was here, of course, as part of the IAAF at the time. We had Sergei Bubka, we had Harrison Dillard and Wyoming Tice and Dick Fosbury. It was really a who's who.
Another Ukrainian, Valerie
Borzov, yes.
Sprinter. So it wasn't just distance runners.
No, it was
people recognized jumpers in there. Yeah.
We had Ralph Boston. We had commitments to have both Bannister and Landy there, but then Landy got appointed governor of Victoria and he said, I can't come. And Bannister was already, I think, showing signs of physical health issues and he didn't want to travel, so he didn't come. Edwin Moses was supposed to come and he bailed the very last minute. He's the only guy that didn't come through. Bruce Jenner, former Bruce Jenner. And
well, it's interesting how many people you knew. This pretty much everybody you hadn't met by then.
Yeah. It was a fantastic event and it was a real gala. And some people say it may have been the best athletic celebration ever because of the caliber of the athletes that were there. And when we introduced them, for example, for the evening, we had the symphony playing. When we introduced Dick Fosbury, we had actually a high jump bar on the door at 7'5", wherever he jumped, he comes in through that. And then Sergei Bubka comes in the other door where the pole vaults, his world record pole vaults. Donovan Bailey, the sprinter, he was there, and Bruni Surin, and then Herb Elliott. And actually one person that we invited who passed away just before the event was Emil Zatopek. But his wife, Ina, came. She was also a gold medalist. Yeah. And I actually escorted her in. She was the last person in, and we had black and white footage of Emil winning the 5,000 in Helsinki. The one where Chataway falls. I don't know if you ever see that race. But we had Vivaldi, the music playing in the background, and the place was literally in tears because it was so emotional.
Do you have memorabilia from that event?
I have a video of it, which I've never even looked at. I should dig it out and take a look at it. So it was a fabulous event.
I don't know if there's copyright on it, but that would be a really nice thing to share with everybody.
Yeah, it would be. Let me see what I can do. At my table, I had Mr. Pyre, Jack Pyre and his wife came up for this, and I had Frank Shorter at my table. And I'd met Frank before through Marty LaQuarrie, and we just got on really well. He's very funny, articulate, and we had a lot of fun. But then 2 nights later, I did organize a Villanova and Friends event. I rented a pub, and I invited people from the Irish diaspora who I know here in the city. And at our event, we had Mr. Pyre and his wife, and it was his birthday. So we made it sort of a birthday celebration. But Eamon Coughlin, Craig Masbach, Don Hartnett, Frank Shorter, Sebastian Coe, his wife, and Nikki at the time. It was just a fabulous environment. It was just such a great atmosphere. It was one of the best parties ever in my own experience, because it was such a positive spirit. And that night I stood up and told some stories, Villanova stories, and I told the story about Eamon Coughlin and his prowess. And I told John Hartnett, of course, he ran 354 mile in his junior year. The night Dave Waddle and Steve Prefontaine were going to go for the world record. Here's John at 2-miler, cross-country runner, runs 354. I told the story about John, Jesus Spy from Ireland. He was putting the miles. And I told everybody about the famous 5 frolic weekends. John would run the frolic on a Friday night, and then he'd run 2 frolics on Saturday and 2 frolics on Sunday. And he says, at the 9-mile mark, we also had a very famous point, and it was called Mount Fuck. And I says, yeah, John was out there in the weekend. He got 5 times again, and the place was just roaring. John said that he's very sheepish and shy, but it was just hilarious. Of course, we celebrated Mr. Pyre and his birthday. Craig Masbach stood up and said a few words, and Craig tells this great story. It was a 2-mile relay at the Philly Inquirer games, and Villanova and Princeton were going head to head. I think it was 74 or 75. Craig was anchoring the Princeton team, and Eamon was anchoring the Villanova team, and they got the stick. I think Villanova slightly ahead, but Craig was pretty good runners, And Masbach, he remembers his voice, Ken Shepard, who was the voice of Villanova and the heart and the soul, actually, great super guy. He's yelling at Eamon, don't worry, Eamon, it's only Masbach. And Masbach heard that, and then like 50 years later, it was so shocking to him, but it still rings in his mind that it's only Masbach.
Fantastic. Let's talk about your book. But what was the process of doing it? Of course, it's the 16-year winning streak of the distance medley relay at the Penn Relays by Villanova.
Right.
Touching greatness. I know it fascinated you. At what point did it become a thing? After how many wins?
Subconsciously, I always felt I never contributed to the program the way I thought I should and wanted to. So I left Villanova with this sort of sense of emptiness. And it was one of the saddest days of my life, Matthew. I literally wept because I knew the 4 years that I had was special. I came with such great promise and dreams, and I was leaving and didn't really happen. And that part of my life was over. It was a very sad day for me. And going back to a place where I grew up, but I literally went from a place where no one knew a single person I went to school with, and where I went to school, no one knew a single person I grew up with. So it was 2 totally different worlds. So I guess subconsciously, I've always was thinking I'd like to remedy that, and I never really thought it through. And I was having a conversation with Dave Patrick. It was probably in about 2012 or so. He told me about his experience and the fact that he and Charlie Messenger came to Villanova at the same time. They were high school teammates, and they're both very good runners. Dave was the top miler, and I think Charlie might have been the top 2 miler in the U.S. that year in high school from Baltimore, from the same school, and they both came to Villanova. And they were freshmen, of course. And at that time, freshmen weren't allowed to compete with the varsity. And so because of that, there was always a sort of separation. And it really dawned on me that the culture that I experienced and that we were part of and that we passed on had to be very much influenced by that Patrick Messenger relationship. Because of that friendship they brought into Villanova, they created this centrum of friendship and camaraderie with the freshmen, and that carried right through the Patrick era. And then it really occurred to me that the whole streak, I remember then in 2018, which was the 50th anniversary of Patrick and the Villanova winning 5 championships of America. There was a special event held at Villanova that year, the breakfast of the Penn relays at Villanova. And Dave Patrick used the words in his talk celebrating those 5 wins, the 4x1 mile, the 4x half, the sprint medley, distance medley, and the 4x4. He talked about the greatness, and he said, touching greatness forever together. And I wrote it down, and I never really thought about it too much until I started looking at the idea of writing a book. And I started writing some things already in 2019, 2020. Then COVID hit, and then I was called to be an interim CEO for a company for a period of time, and I put everything aside. Then in 21, I said, okay, now is the time to get at it. So what I did then, did a bunch of research. I'm fortunate to have a good memory, so I didn't really have to do a lot of research because a lot of it's just locked up in here. But I decided I would need to interview all these key people. And of course, by that time, my original thought was to start in the Eastern Seaboard, go to Florida, start with LaQuarrie, visit Ken Shepard, move up to North Carolina where Don Page lives, and then Patrick lives in Washington, and then Philadelphia area, Marcus and John Hartnett and John Burns. So that was my original thinking. But of course, COVID made it possible that Zoom became the acceptable medium. And I thought, shit, I don't need to travel. I can connect with people this way. So I did a whole series of interviews and used that. And I sat down with a really good friend of mine, Jim Dennison, who had run at Fordham and was a pretty good runner. And he knew all about Penn relays because he was from New York, Scotch Plains or White Plains, one of those places in New Rockdale where Ronaldo Nehemiah comes from. And he, of course, New York, the whole high school system is so competitive and Penn relays. And he'd written a couple of books. He'd written a book on Haile Gabriel Selassie, the greatest. And he was a prof here at the University of Alberta. He'd done his PhD at Illinois, I think it was. And we got to become great friends. And he helped me kind of think through the structure of how I should go do it. The thing I really remember about Jim, he says at the end, you got to keep the plate spinning, When you get to the end of a chapter, set it up in such a way that you want to read the next one, which I think I did. But Jim, unfortunately, he picked up this really strange skin cancer and he passed away a year ago. And he's 62 years of age and just suddenly gone. To answer your question, I really got into it the fall of 21 and it came together really quite quickly. In the spring of I think I was done. I had it written within 3 or 4 months and then go through the process of editing it.
And you had done technical writing before, so I'm for writing.
I write all the time. I'm, reports, proposals, briefs. So writing is sort of my wheelhouse. And poetry. It's poetry.
If anybody hasn't read the book, it's not just about the distance medley. It's about the people. It's running fans and running peers, or the insights into all the great runners. There's a chapter on LaQuarrie, understanding Jumbo Elliott, some of the stuff we've talked about. But it's a brilliant book about life and the times and everything.
It's really about this question. What was it about this school at this point in time and the culture there that drove this kind of performance for a sustained period of time, not just for 4 years?
Yeah, it's not Tom Brady winning 7 Super Bowls.
Yeah, just when you think about it, if you look at the era of that 16-year period, you watch from Dave Patrick to Chris Mason to Marty LaQuarrie to John Hartnett to Ken Shepard to Don Page to Mark Balger to Phil King.
Eamon won four watches too. Yeah.
Well, he won, I think, a total 8 or 9.
He won 4 in one race.
Yeah,
he won 4.
Marcus O'Sullivan, Sidney Marie, and that list, if you look at it, there's one world champion or world best after the next. And there's no school that can boast that. How did that happen? How did a small school in the Eastern U.S. build this kind of culture and sustained output for such a period of time? What was it about this place, this group of people, this culture, these individuals? What was it? That's what the book is about.
What did you think the short answer was when you started writing the book?
It definitely was the culture that Jumbo Elliott created. I call it a creative dissonance, a sense of what you can achieve. And his brilliance was who he recruited. He recruited athletes that were leaders, self-motivated, had a physical structure that they could move easily from the half mile to the mile. Like the athletes, quite typically slender, intelligence. He always asked about family. And you look at most of the kids that came there came from working class backgrounds. So he knew that when they got to Villanova, they were going to be motivated, and just letting the leaders become leaders, and building that culture and passing it. It was like a really multi-dimensional, sophisticated relay team that just kept passing the baton.
How was the reception of your book among your teammates in Villanova?
It was really well. I wrote the book for three reasons. One, of course, I didn't feel I had really contributed, so here was an opportunity. Secondly, to really answer the questions, but thirdly, to really pay tribute to the excellence and the commitment and the performance of these athletes, which I don't think had ever been recognized in the way it deserved. So,
Okay. I would just tell people they've got to get the book. Let's go back to the other events that you organized, the
Right.
Junior Pan Ams, and
Right.
the Olympic trials. It had been 15 years since your gala.
Right.
How? And you worked as a CEO, as a consultant, management, worked with a lot of people. How did you get involved, and what was the experience of those things in Canada?
In about 2005, a new executive director for Alberta Athletics came to town. His name is Peter Ogilvie. Peter was an Olympian, 200-meter runner, a very accomplished runner himself. He was a fifth man on the 4x1 that won in Athens that beat the Americans with Don. So he was a fifth in that team. So it shocked the Americans by winning the gold. Peter came to town, and he learned very quickly that I was a guy to know. We started doing some stuff together, and I helped facilitate some strategic planning for Athletics Alberta, and then the idea of forming an organization. We called it Track Town Canada. Boys in Oregon didn't like it too much, but there wasn't much they could do about it. And we actually bid on the Pan American Juniors, put together a group, and we won that bid. And then we won the bid to host the Canadian Nationals in 2015, and then the Olympic trials in 2016. And that probably will go down as one of the best Olympic trials we've ever had, because we had Derek Drouin, the high jumper. We had, of course, Andre DeGrasse. We had the pentathlete, Thiessen. What's her name? I'm going to get criticized on not being able to pull everybody's name out of the hat just like that. But it was just a fabulous meet, and the place was packed. And then we went on to bid, and we actually won the World Juniors. I went to London, and I got to present a bid for the World Junior Athletic Championships to be held in 2020. Unfortunately, COVID derailed that, and we pulled out, but we won that bid as well. But we just had a really great team put together, and I was able to chair that and bring people to the table because of my connections in the city. I've been the chair of a fairly important organization that ran basically all the events, including the hockey arena, for a number of years. And so you get to know people because of that. And those connections helped make the events that you just referred to a success.
Yeah. Wow, you made so many contributions to the running community across your career and running these events. Jerry, I know we could just keep talking. And perhaps we will after I stop recording, but a little bit. Thank you very much for all your time. These are great stories. I definitely love your book. I encourage everybody to read it. I'll feature it on the cast website there. It's great to meet you. You're a gracious guy with a smile on your face, and it is nice that you have this great memory and we're able to get all these stories out of you.
Yeah, and let me just maybe close by saying this, Matt. In the end, it's not what you did, it's what you've become. And what's in the becoming, that's becoming a contributing citizen, a parent, a mentor, a professional. Because when you're in the thick of competition, you focus on how well you run or how well you place or how fast, and you can develop a value system that's based on performance. Important, but it's not the end. It's only a stepping stone to what you should be looking at. And that's what Jumbo saw. He really wanted his athletes to do well, but he's not at compromising school. If he would get a sense and he would look at the grades, and if you weren't doing well and he didn't want to see you, get your goddamn ass to the library is what he would literally say. And when you got to graduate, his view was, now it's time to grow up and get a job, start a family, and be a responsible citizen. And so until Le Quarry, that was pretty much what happened. There were a few people after Le Quarry who wanted to continue their career, and he would say, listen, you're a good runner, you're a good athlete, but you'll never be the best in the world. So get on with your life. He was pretty blunt. And I know a couple of cases where he said that and people didn't like what they heard, but he was right. And so I say, really, I know my career didn't end up where I wanted it to be, but in the end, does it make any difference? It might have actually deferred or distracted me from accomplishing some of the things I've done professionally and otherwise, because I would have hung on to something that I could have been a good runner, but I would have never been a Eamon Coughlin or a Steve Ovett or a Seb Coe. I didn't have that extra gear that those guys all had. So you would have been a good runner, and now what? Now what? If you had sacrificed your profession or your education or made some decisions that would have compromised where you could have been. I think it's really important to understand track as a stepping stone, as a means. It's not an end, it's a means to develop character, to develop discipline, develop performance, develop confidence, but it's only en route to something bigger and better in your life.
That's a great summary. Give everybody a lot to think about. I think spending time with you, Jerry, does feel like it's an opportunity to do a little bit of touching greatness. Thank you very much. You're charming to be with. Thank you very much for all your time, Jerry.
Real pleasure, Matt.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed another episode. Do you have someone you'd like to hear interviewed on the podcast? You can leave a comment on the YouTube channel or on the website, running70s.com. That's running70s.com. Let me know what you think of the episodes and anyone, including yourself, you'd like to hear interviewed. I hope you enjoyed another episode of Running in the 70s. Voices, stories, and memories of athletes who were running in the 70s. Until next time, wherever you are, keep looking forward and don't forget to look back.